Yeah, when I'm done. Okay, good morning, everybody. Of course, I forgot my glasses, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this right. we have three speakers today, and the first what? Oh, sorry. Okay, got me. And you speakers, keep that in mind. You got to be rock singers up here. Okay. The first one I want to introduce is Christine Miranda. She is, on the top of her list is she's recently married. And she works as a community activist in mental health. She's a peer advocate. She is a certified substance abuse counselor. She volunteers for Metropolitan State Hospital. And she is a volunteer Protestant chaplain for the Linwood Sheriff Station. And she does, in our own voice, presentations for NAMI, and she's active in NAMI. Thanks, Christine. Why don't you come on up and take a seat at the table here? Okay, and then I'm going to introduce Brittany Weissman. Brittany is the executive director of NAMI Los Angeles County. She has been in that post for 2 years. Before that, she worked for 12 years with the California Endowment in Management. She graduated from Occidental College. I had to put her I forced her to put that in because I also graduated from Oxy. And she had an advanced degree from USC, and she pursued public policy degrees. She has a special passion for NAMI because her mother suffers from bipolar disorder. So most people in NAMI have a family connection. So welcome, Brittany. And the third speaker is Peter Eliasberg. He is the legal director for the ACLU of Southern California. He worked, among many other things, the ACLU has monitored Los Angeles County jails for years, and they published a report in 2008, which he worked on. This report was on the treatment of inmates with mental illness, and recently the ACLU, he and another person, they co-authored a report that came out in July of 2014 called A Way Forward, Diverting People with Mental Illness from Inhumane and Expensive Jails into Community-based treatment that works. And both Brittany and Peter are on the task force that District Attorney Jackie Lacey formed to look into ways to deal with mentally ill people in a different way rather than just throwing them in jail. Okay, so thank you very much, and Peter, you can come up, and you're going to have to pass this around. And when it comes to questions, please repeat the questions that people ask. Do you want to move this? Yes. I'm going to move this so you guys can see.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for having us and having me here. My name is Brittany Weissman. I'm the Executive Director for NAMI Los Angeles County Council, or NAMI LACC for short.
What does NAMI stand for?
The National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so we're a national organization with chapters or affiliates locally, and the most local chapter to you is San Gabriel Valley, based here in Pasadena. NAMI LACC represents about 5,000 people who are affected with mental illness, serious mental illness more specifically, their family and their friends. We advocate for lives of dignity and respect without stigma and discrimination for all people affected by serious mental illness. I'm going to speak for a bit, then I'll pass it this way to Peter Eliasberg, who's the legal director for the ACLU, and then to Christine Miranda, who is a NAMI member who has experience with the criminal justice system. So let's get into today's issue, the criminalization of mental illness. When one looks at the statistics, the numbers of mentally ill inmates in the U.S. justice system is alarming. One surprising fact is as many as 1 in 5 in the U.S. justice system have been diagnosed with a mental illness. It's alarming. Rather than providing these individuals with the proper care they need, like a person with cancer would receive chemotherapy or a person with diabetes would receive insulin along with their regular doctor's visits, people with mental illness are often criminalized and placed in the justice system rather than with a doctor and the tools and medications they need to recover. As most people realize, jails and prisons are places of high stress and low attention when it comes to sufficient medical care, which exacerbates mental health conditions and leads to negative outcomes. Their stay in these facilities often causes their conditions to become worse, which adds to the revolving cycle in and out of the justice system for them. When it comes to rehabilitation, correctional facilities are one of the worst places to be. So that's clear. So let me now tell you a little bit about NAMI. At NAMI, we work really hard every day to provide education to the public about those with mental illness in the justice system, and then we also advocate for correctional mental health systems to do the right thing, which is something we have in common with the ACLU here. One program that we've been working on for a number of years that we're very proud of is called CIT, or Crisis Intervention Training. And that's a program that trains professionals in compassionate response and de-escalation techniques when interacting with those with a mental illness. CIT promotes both enhanced safety for the police officer or the law enforcement agent, and then also with the person experiencing the mental health crisis. These improved encounters have the potential to lead to appropriate diversion strategies from jail into community-based treatment called pre-booking, and in the event, pre-booking diversion, and in the event that someone is actually arrested or detained, post-booking diversion, and I'll talk about that in a little while. LAPD has used CIT training for a number of years, and we hope they maintain their commitment to doing CIT. But cities not served by the Sheriff's Department or LAPD must also implement CIT so that we have a consistent first responders approach to the county's criminal justice system. Because if everybody does something different across the county, we're going to have an inconsistent approach, and that's just not what we're aiming for. We're very encouraged to see the Sheriff's Department right now planning for a new training program. It's being developed by the National Institute of Corrections. It's called CIT for Corrections, and it's to train custody deputies, so people who work in the jails, on similar de-escalation techniques designed for jail settings. And NAMI is going to be a participant in their pilot program this December, and then we're going to do further expansion coming in 2015. So that's a program we're very excited about. But criminalization of mental illness is more than just a policy topic. For many NAMI members, as some of you in this audience can know, it can be an immediate, urgent crisis. Every month, NAMI National's helpline receives hundreds of phone calls asking for assistance. Individuals want to know whether it's safe to call 911 for a person they love who is in crisis. Families want to know what to do if police have detained a loved one. And families struggle to cope with having loved ones in the jail or prison system for years, wondering if they're getting the treatment they need, all the while reading in the newspaper every day that it's more than likely not happening. So let's talk for a minute about how we got to this critical juncture. I'll talk for a minute about deinstitutionalization and transinstitutionalization. So deinstitutionalization arrived in the 1970s and 1980s. It was the closing of our state hospitals with the intent of funding a robust community-based mental health treatment system. But the hospitals closed, as we know, but the funding was not forthcoming. So we built prisons in the 1980s, as you might remember, not mental health care facilities. And as time went on, officials noticed a sharp increase in the number of homeless people with mental illness arriving in the jails. And then, of course, that led to the increased numbers of prison inmates with mental illness, too. This has been called the transinstitutionalization of people with mental illness, the transfer of this population from state hospitals to now jails and prisons. While well-intentioned reform efforts in the late 1960s meant to protect the liberties of people with mental illness, and the lack of due process regarding their detainment in state hospitals culminated in something called Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act, or LPS. Although establishing the protection of civil patient rights, certain aspects of this law have resulted in a barrier to treatment for many of the most severely mentally ill who do not engage in treatment voluntarily. So some people with mental illness have insight into their illness and they will accept services and treatment, and some people lack that insight and are not interested in seeking treatment services voluntarily. Well, that, along with major cost shifting from the states to the federal government following the advent of Medicare and Medicaid, has led to the greatest component of today's mental health crisis. That is, individuals with serious mental illness living in the community without the treatment they need and the support systems they need, and they are attempting to receive care from a completely overwhelmed and inadequately funded mental health system. This whole process led to the criminalization of mental illness for Americans with severe psychiatric illnesses. America's jails and prisons, as you know, are now surrogate hospitals for thousands of individuals living with mental illness. There are more than 19,000 inmates at the LA County jails on most days. According to intake officers who are with the local Department of Mental Health, some 15% of these inmates suffer from conditions like personality disorders, addictions, delusions, and schizophrenia, and many more may be undiagnosed, as you can imagine. So let's get a little bit more into LA and the problems here. For years, county officials have been struggling to improve conditions for the mentally ill in Twin Towers and Men's Central Jail, both in downtown LA. The facilities are operated by the Sheriff's Department, but care inside the facilities is operated by the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. In a dramatic move designed to force reforms, the United States Department of Justice, or the DOJ, sought a court-enforceable agreement to improve how LA County treats thousands of mentally ill inmates. The federal government used a similar consent decree to impose changes at the once problem-plagued LAPD at a cost of tens of millions of dollars a year. For mentally ill people, LA County lockups can be a total nightmare. In the letter this year, the DOJ described dimly lit, vermin-infested, noisy, unsanitary, cramped, and crowded conditions living inside the jail. These conditions can send somebody who is unstable over the edge. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, started looking into the jail facilities in 1992. 10 years later, the department and county entered into a memorandum of agreement to resolve issues related to mental health care. The county, till today, has failed to fully comply, which leads us to today. According to the DOJ, they said there is inadequate mental health care to prevent prisoners from becoming suicidal, to identify suicidal prisoners, or to prevent prisoners from going into crisis. Under a new federal consent decree, a judge would appoint a monitor to oversee jail reforms. The county will be legally obligated to follow that monitor's direction, and maybe Peter will speak a little bit more about that. Board of Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas said the problem facing the county about the constitutionality of mental health services in the jails is serious, and the stakes are high. Well, obviously, you know, we're all here today because of that. Terry McDonald, who is the assistant sheriff for custody, who runs the LA County jails, admits that we can do better. She thinks that one day we're going to look back and wonder what took us so long to get to the right place. That's been a question for years. Conditions for mentally ill inmates in the county have been a focus of federal probes since the 1990s. And the number of inmates with psychiatric disorders has been an issue in the recent debate over building a new jail in downtown LA. Keeping a mentally ill person behind bars, though, can cost about or more than $50,000 annually, while treatment outside in the community can run about 2/3 less. So let's talk about some solutions and options. Housing and treating a mentally ill offender outside the LA County jail system can cost about $20,000 annually, according to a report issued by the American Civil Liberties Union in July of this year, which NAMI National and NAMI LA endorsed. Here are 4 avenues outlined in that report which reduce the criminalization of mentally ill people and keep them out of jail in the first place and do better by them. First, we have pre-booking diversion, and I'll go through each of these. Studies show that crisis intervention teams, these CIT teams, significantly reduce arrests of people with serious mental illness while better identifying individuals who need psychiatric care. Individuals who are diverted by properly trained CIT officers, that's from jail to community treatment, coordinated with pre-booking diversion programs, receive more counseling. They receive medication and other forms of treatment rather than individuals who are not diverted. Second, we have post-booking jail diversion. This is about mental health courts. Mental health courts evolved from the original drug court model and utilize a collaborative problem-solving approach versus the traditional adversarial criminal court process. Post-booking diversion programs have proven effective in reducing incarceration while maintaining accountability and improving treatment outcomes. Collaborative courts potentially reduce the amount of time offenders with serious mental illness spend in jail, they increase the amount of mental health treatment they get, and they reduce costs over time. Third, we have supportive housing, which is a no-brainer. Placing individuals who are homeless and who have serious mental illness in supportive housing with the social services they need, often in the same building, reduces time spent in jail, reduces the financial burdens to the system. In one study, the costs to the criminal justice system were reduced by the supportive housing so much that the costs were covered by the supportive housing. Finally, we have ACT. It's called Assertive Community Treatment, or known in LA as FSP, or Full Service Partnerships. These kinds of programs treat individuals with serious mental illness who have been involved in the criminal justice system by providing round-the-clock intensive services in the community. These services also reduce jail days, the number of days in jail. For now, though, in LA County, the emphasis has been on back end of the system called reentry, after the catastrophe of criminalization has already occurred. We must do more to keep justice-involved offenders with mental illness out of jail in the first place. We must expand our program capacity to meaningful levels that truly move the needle for us. Our job as advocates in LA County is to help leadership form a political will to form a cohesive, integrated, long-term plan and locate the resources to implement that plan that help treat the problem appropriately. How can we possibly debate spending millions and billions of dollars on a new jail in the absence of that fully formed, comprehensive strategic plan that addresses the entire criminal justice system, from first responders, so that's person on the street gets called 911, to discharge, to linkage to community services like NAMI in the community, or like other resources in the community that can help people with mental illness achieve recovery. That brings us to today, to District Attorney Jackie Lacey's task force that Marty outlined. In an effort to investigate and dissect each of these potential solutions, the four that I just outlined, the District Attorney for Los Angeles County, Jackie Lacey, has led a task force on criminal justice and mental health, of which NAMI and the ACLU are a part. DA Lacey convened leaders from across LA County and city agencies, including the Sheriff's Department, Fire and Police Department, Public Defender, Alternate Public Defender, and judges and advocates. She hired the nationally recognized SAMHSA's Gain Center to produce a report and summit to educate the county about national models of doing this kind of work better. The task force is the county-wide effort to address how people with mental illness are treated in jail and by the criminal justice system. Post-booking, the DA, Lacey, believes that the county can do better by people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. She's a real trooper on this, a real strong leader on this. Recent topics of discussion at our meetings that Peter and I both attend are creating a common database for all law enforcement agencies so that they have a common area to look up for somebody they encounter on the street, perhaps. Training all law enforcement on CIT, like I mentioned earlier. Training judges, DAs, public defenders on the challenges of living with a mental illness is a big topic that we talk about. Ideally, these types of trainings would educate criminal justice professionals on behaviors that mentally ill people engage in that sometimes lead them to encounters with the police. Sometimes small infractions like urinating in public or stealing a candy bar, things like that. The leadership from the DA and the whole task force is kind of mapping out all of LA County services and the gaps in those services and areas for program expansion so that we can find solutions to these difficult problems. Later, we'll hear from Christine Miranda, a resilient individual and NAMI member who also has a very compelling story to share about her experience being a person with mental illness and her involvement in the criminal justice system. With the power of the partnership between the Board of Supervisors, the District Attorney, and the Department of Mental Health, we believe, NAMI believes, that we are confident that changes can be implemented that will make the situation a better one for all of us. DA Lacey's efforts will ultimately provide the Board of Supervisors a template or a set of recommendations to implement in our county that will lead to better outcomes. DA Lacey will present more detail on her report next Wednesday at the Board of Supervisors meeting, which is open to the public, so you're very welcome to attend. I think that many NAMI members will be there, and the ACLU will be there, along with other advocates who support this diversion programming. It starts at 9:30 on the 12th, which is Wednesday of next week. So before I pass this on to Peter and my colleagues here, I wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Our society has basically neglected getting treatment for people who need the treatment when they need it. This often leads them into encounters with law enforcement and incarceration in our jails and prisons, which are the worst places for recovery. We must decriminalize mental illness. Though some violent people have mental illness, people with mental illness are neither innately violent nor are they criminals. Only a very small subset of this population show tendencies towards violence, and often the barriers to involuntary treatment inherent in our statutes perpetuate the continuous flow of negative headlines that we see in the news. And add to that the lack of acute inpatient resources. In fact, 25 counties in California have no inpatient beds at all. Or longer-term residential subacute care, and you basically have a factory for stigma, which leads to discrimination for people with mental illness. The result is predictable. Offenders with mental illness are inappropriately jailed for nonviolent, low-level crimes, but we must remember that coping with mental illness is no crime. Many of NAMI's members are family members who are profoundly affected by the horrific experiences of their loved ones in jail. Jail is, of course, a terrible place, but for somebody with mental illness, it's especially terrible. The lack of adequate care can exacerbate symptoms, as I spoke of, and sometimes lead to suicide, which has happened. On the other hand, diversion from jail into community-based treatment improves people's lives. It helps address the reasons that people cycle in and out of jail in the first place, and thereby improves public safety. Let's try where it makes sense to keep people with mental illness out of jails in the first place. But if we're going to plan for a new jail anyways, let's be sure to plan for diverting people with mental illness in the first place, okay? And just to be clear, the Board of Supervisors and other LA County leadership is currently planning and scoping out the construction site for a new jail that's gonna cost over $2 billion or close to $2 billion. Peter will likely touch on that as well. The size and scope of that new jail should really be informed by the work of the District Attorney's Task Force, and that's something that NAMI's advocated for, and I think the ACLU has as well. Everybody should be accountable under the law, but no one should be punished for being mentally ill, and that's the NAMI perspective. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to pass it to Peter.
So thank you all for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this topic and to talk about it with my fellow panelists who have different perspectives. Not disagreeing perspectives, but different perspectives on this issue, and maybe come at it from different starting places. But I think that there's a very wide common ground that we share. So I think it'll be helpful just very quickly to explain how I got involved in this issue. I'm the legal director at the ACLU of Southern California. For many, many years, the ACLU has monitored conditions in the LA County jails, and we have been concerned for many, many years about treatment of people with mental illness in the jails, and Brittany certainly talked about some of the conditions there. In 2008, we worked with one of the nation's preeminent forensic psychiatrists, Dr. Terry Coopers, to put out a report about the conditions and the treatment of people with mental illness in the jails, and believe me, it's not a pretty picture. There was sort of inevitably an effort to push for the better treatment of people with mental illness in the jails. But I had a very profound moment with Dr. Coopers when we were talking about, how you can make changes in the way people who are mentally ill, who have mental illness, are treated in incarceration, what you can do to improve conditions, treatment, suicide prevention, and so on. And he said to me, well, Peter, if you really want to protect the rights of people with mental illness in jail and prison, don't put them in jail and prison. And that, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, there are ways, and there are some jurisdictions in this country who do a much better job of this than we do in Los Angeles. Not a lot, but there are places where the focus of people with mental illness who become justice involved, at least those who are not charged with very serious violent offenses, is to do everything possible to avoid incarceration. And he said, we can spend a lot of time and spend a fortune trying to improve, as has been going on now and for 20 years in California, trying to improve the way people with mental illness in the prison system are treated. Although I don't want to make it seem like it's a cooperative effort, because there's been a tremendous amount of resistance from the state prison system and CDCR to doing that. But federal courts and plaintiffs' lawyers, who I see as sort of angels, the people at the prison law office and Rosenbein, who've tried to do that. But intrinsically, what the top forensic psychiatrists will tell you is jails are and prisons by their nature are places of punishment. They're places of control. They will always be run by, in the case of a jail, the sheriff's department, or by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for the prison system. They will never be, even if there are psychiatrists and clinicians there, they will never be run by those people. And so this will always be primarily a function of punishment, not a function of treatment, not a function of healing. And therefore, you cannot really honestly improve the treatment of people with mental illness by focusing on sort of building better jails or building better prisons. Now, having said that, there are going to be people with mental illness who will be, the community is going to demand that they be incarcerated because of the violent nature of their offenses. And so I think it's very important that we not forget, we not allow the conditions that are in the jails to continue. But one of the fundamental thing I think we have to do is also say a lot of people who are in this situation should not be here, and we have to get them out. The three largest psychiatric institutions, and I'm not suggesting they provide good care, but places, the three largest were in terms of the population of people with mental illness in the United States, you know what they are? Los Angeles County Jail, Cook County Jail, and Rikers Island Correctional Facility in New York. Those are the three largest, and I don't think fourth is even close. So we have, as Brittany eloquently laid out, and I'm not going to go back over it again, basically taken, we've criminalized mental illness. We have refused to develop a robust community mental health system in this country, and inevitably what's happened is we've turned our correctional system into a de facto mental health system. And it doesn't work. I'm not going to repeat, but I'll just add a few things in terms of why it doesn't work. I mean, the crowding, the vermin, all of those things. But in addition, there are, and it's well documented, and it's true across correctional systems across the country, there are much higher levels of sexual abuse directed at inmates with mental illness than other inmates. There's much higher level of violence, both inmate on inmate violence and deputy on inmate violence. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the obvious ones is a lot of people with mental illness can't figure, jail and prison is about sort of playing by the rules, very strict rules that are imposed by corrections officers, and severe punishment if you don't play by the rules. Well, a lot of people with mental illness, they're not deliberately saying, I don't want to abide by the rules. They can't figure out the rules. They don't fit in. And therefore, they're oftentimes inmates and correctional officers will punish them in a variety of different ways that can be both forms of physical abuse, but also the classic discipline in jail and prison is administrative segregation, which is another word for solitary confinement. Well, solitary confinement, as many of you have recognized, would turn, to use probably politically incorrect phrasing, sane people crazy, but people who are vulnerable and have mental illness do far worse. But somebody who acts out as a result of mental illness in the jail system, the deputies say, okay, you didn't get in line when I asked, you're going to the hole. Well, the hole is solitary confinement. And then there's, necessary, almost inevitably, decompensation of the mental illness and so on. People are released from jail. They oftentimes end up being homeless, go to emergency rooms, many of which don't have psychiatric. So they're set up to be medical treatment facilities, but they go to emergency rooms because police, if they don't book them, don't know where to take them. Then they end up back in the jail system, and we have a horrific cycle of recidivism through the criminal justice system. The recidivism rate with people for mental illness in LA County is probably in the neighborhood of 90+%. Now, the recidivism rate isn't great for people without mental illness, but it's much lower. And as Brittany said, we spend a lot more money to incarcerate someone with mental illness than we would, and treat them badly, than we would to provide really top-notch, top-of-the-line community treatment in the community. We get worse results from public safety because of the recidivism rate. And if you sort of ask the public policy, the first-year public policy student to look at this system of incarceration and say, what grade would you give it on a public policy basis? Well, they'd say, it's far more expensive, it's far less effective, and it's destroying lives. You probably give it an F. And yet this is what the county and the state have been doing for the last 20 years. So as Brittany said, there are choices. There are things that we can do dramatically better than we're currently doing. As much as I applaud, although I think it's taken them far too long to bring out the hammer, I applaud DOJ's recent announcement that they're not accepting a voluntary agreement with the county. They're going to get a consent decree, which is just another way of saying there's a court and the ability to get enforcement through a federal court through contempt proceedings. I think DOJ itself said, we can't order you to stop incarcerating as many people with mental illness if they're criminally charged, but we applaud the efforts to do better, because if you get a lot of people with mental illness out of the jails, you will A, improve their lot, but B, by having, in any jail system, the more you have of anything, the more inmates you have, the harder it is to provide decent services to those who are there. So those who remain because of the serious levels of their charges will also be treated much better if we move into this diversion model. So where are we now, and what can be done to speed this process? Well, I share Brittany's optimism, probably cautiously less optimistic than she is. Not that I don't think that we can get where we need to go, but because I still think that there are pretty significant obstacles. I have incredible admiration for DA Lacey for taking a leadership role in this. It is not typical for district attorneys to say, how can we figure out how to charge fewer people? How can we figure out how to incarcerate fewer people? I believe she's deeply committed to it. I also really like the mentality she's exhibited, which frankly is not common from many, many politicians, particularly I see on the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles County, which is, I'm going to look elsewhere to see how things are done better. Whenever I go to the Board of Supervisors and they're talking about problems, they bring in the people who are running the agencies that have failed for 20 years, and they say, what are we going to do about it? And her model has been, I'm going to look in San Antonio, I'm going to look in Miami, who have probably the best diversion programs in the country, and see what you're doing. So I really like that perspective. I think the Board of Supervisors is finally starting to get the message. But 18 months ago, when there was, once again, there was an announcement that the Department of Justice was again looking at the problems with the treatment of people with mental illness in the jail, and there was an acknowledgement that we had a crisis with how the criminal justice system was handling people with mental illness. The first proposal, and I really believe it was well-intentioned, the first proposal was, let's build a big, new, better mental health jail. And I sort of thought, oh my God, this is really where we're going. This is the best this county can do. Well, 18 months later, you all are having a forum on this issue. The Board of Supervisors is starting to talk and beginning to fund an effort to do something differently. The district attorney has effectively pulled together a lot of voices, but I think there are a lot of people on the Board of Supervisors who still don't quite get it. At a meeting as little as 6 months ago, one member of the Board of Supervisors said, well, it's not our responsibility. I mean, we have to provide jail beds for everybody that that the judges sentence. Well, I then went to a judge whom I knew said, I don't want to sentence these people, a lot of these people. Many of the DAs in my court don't want to sentence people with mental illness, just don't have anywhere else to direct them. So this idea that the Board of Supervisors has no responsibility because people with mental illness are ending up in the jails because the criminal justice system wants to sentence them is incredibly uninformed. The reality is the Board of Supervisors has not provided enough funding for a community mental health system that would allow judges like Judge Smerling, who sits in the Superior Court here, to have the choices when those people who he says probably 50% of the people who come in front of him with mental illness, and he doesn't want to put in jail, and he knows it's not a good idea to put them in jail. And in fact, I'd highly encourage you to, if you want to really see the worst of the worst, there's a column by Steve Lopez in the LA Times, I remember exactly how many months ago, about a story about a young man who ended up in the criminal justice system. The judge wanted him to go into a dual diagnosis, i.e. drug and mental health diversion program. There were not a bed available. The first time he was in, he was supposed to be only released. The judge didn't want him in jail, but the judge said, okay, until the bed becomes available, we need to keep him there. The day the bed becomes available, that's where to be released. Instead, the sheriff's department dumped him on the street, and then he was reincarcerated because his family really felt that the best thing they could do when he committed another relatively minor offense was that they were told he'd be safest in jail. The jail did not treat him as somebody who had a mental illness, even though the last time he'd been in jail, they recognized that he did. They didn't put him in a suicide prevention place, and he hung himself. Now, that's not what happens to everybody with mental illness jail, but that's the kind of story that we see. And yet there are members of the Board of Supervisors who I think their greater interest right now still remains building the better jail rather than focusing on this issue. Having said that, they're starting to hear from voices. They're hearing from NAMI. They're hearing from people in law enforcement. And they're hearing from mental health advocates. But now they're starting to hear from even new voices from religious leaders and business groups who are saying, this is what we're doing is not working, it's a failure, and we want you to do differently. I don't know what political advocacy this group does, but I would highly encourage you, and I'll be happy to talk to anybody here about writing a letter to the Board of Supervisors and saying, you know, we don't want to continue down the path we've been going. Unfortunately, I think Prop 47 is a classic example, and its passage by 60% basically it's a response to the fact that the state legislature and to some extent local politicians have continued to think that all the public wants is tough on crime. Well, I think the public wants to be tough on some kinds of crimes and have a different view towards others. So the political system and our electeds haven't responded in the way, and that's why I think you ended up with Prop 47 on the ballot and a 60% vote for it. I still think we're behind on the Board of Supervisors. I think we can get them there, but I think that's a key issue that we need to really tackle, and I think political advocacy is the way you get there. I think Jackie Lacey's group will help lay a roadmap. But there's going to be, choices that have to be made. The board's going to have to say we need to spend. Overall, this is far cheaper, what Brittany's talking about. It's far cheaper, it's far more effective, works better in every way. It's better policy. But there's going to have to be thinking about, well, okay, wait a minute, we're going to actually spend some money here on community mental health instead of spending money down the line on jails and prisons and the attendant costs. A couple more things on the new jail. It was basically the planning of it and the projections that were made were developed by a construction management firm. Now, they ostensibly consulted with experts, but if you read the report, basically every time they talk about are there ways that we could lower the LA County jail population? Could we have fewer people with mental illness in the jails? The answer was sort of a short no. That's what we got, and there's, there's growing problem with mental illness in this country, so we're going to need, if anything, more beds for people with mental illness. There was no discussion about, well, what are the alternatives? What is Miami doing? Miami's closed. They brag about closing a jail because they are incarcerating many, many fewer people with mental illness. And the ones who go into their diversion program, the recidivism rates have dropped from about 85% to about 20% in their misdemeanor diversion program. Their felony diversion program, they have about a 5% of it recidivism rate, while incarceration was yielding about an 85% recidivism rate. So, these are things that the county can do, but needs to really focus on, and needs not really to leave its jail planning to construction management firms who will say, well, there aren't any alternatives. So whatever jail is built, and I again want to reiterate that there will be people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. Some of them will be incarcerated. We need to have better facilities and treatment than is available in the current Twin Towers. But the question is, should we just sort of blindly go down this path of building a new jail that has the planned bed space for the same number of people with mental illness who are currently in the jail, when the DA is saying, I don't want to put many of those people in jail. Police departments are saying, we don't want to incarcerate these people, because we see them again 6 months later, 9 months later, whatever, on the street again. And we're dealing with the same issues with them because they're not better, they're only worse. So I do think political advocacy is important. I would urge you to exercise that if you believe in what all of us are saying, and you believe in good policy, not failed policy. The last thing I'd say is I do think that the recent election provides some positive news. I am hopeful that the ACLU is nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates, but we can say things once an election is over. I'm hopeful that the person who replaces Gloria Molina, who is the one who said, well, all we do is provide bed space for the people who the judges want to sentence. And what can we do to reduce reduce the number of people with mental illness in the jails? She's being replaced. She's termed out. I'm hopeful that her successor will be better. And both of the three supervisor candidates in the 3rd district, Ms. Kuehl won, but both of them had said during the campaign that they very much want they very much want to look at ways to reduce the population of people with mental illness in the jails. Bobby Shriver actually wrote letters to the Board of Supervisors opposing the jail plan and in favor of diversion. I am hopeful, although Ms. Kuehl didn't do that, I do hope that based on the statement she made on the campaign trail that she will take similar positions. So I think we are moving in the right direction. I agree with Brittany that there are a lot of pieces in place to move us in that direction, but I'm a big believer that a fairly radical change in the way we do things in the criminal justice system and the treatment of mental illness doesn't sort of, you don't make that sea change overnight, and we need to keep the pressure on. We need to keep reminding the Board of Supervisors that the public doesn't just want, with every single person who gets charged with any offense, to lock them up and throw away the key. That we can take different approaches. We need to take different approaches. And the last thing I'll say is I think that I talked to a person who does public finance on bonds, and I said, what's the real cost of a $2 billion jail? Because the price tag, yeah, it's technically they're saying the construction cost is about 1.8. Well, the county's never built something that doesn't have cost overruns, but even if Twin Towers was supposed to be $300 million and it ended up costing about 15% more than that. But let's assume that really the construction cost is $1.8 billion. If you take the interest payments and pay down the principal, the cost is $3.5 billion. That's going to be about $120 million out of the county's general fund every year for the next 30 years. Now, I do think there will be jail construction, but I think it's up to us to see whether that jail construction is a $1.8 billion jail or perhaps a much smaller one that will significantly reduce those costs. Because I can think of better things to do with $120 million a year in the county's general fund than paying down principal and interest on a big jail. And the last thing I'd say is we did a report, as Brittany alluded to, in July 2014. I have a few copies here, but I'm also happy anyone who wants to read it. It really is about exactly this issue. What the criminal justice system does to people with mental illness, how we sort of got here, and ways to do better with very specific examples of programs that work. We're not talking about pie in the sky stuff. What San Antonio is doing, what Miami is doing is working. It's saving money, and there are no stories about, oh, we diverted this person and the next thing you know, terrible things happened. They are safer for doing this. They're saving money for doing this. They're healing communities, families, and individuals, and it can be done. And I'm more than happy to either give out one of my few copies or direct you to our website where you can get copies of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for being here. It's an honor and privilege to be here today. How can I top that? Okay, tell my story. Well, I had high hopes when I was young, growing up in South Central. At 16, I won a scholarship to USC. I worked as a lab technician up to the age of 26. And I went to Europe. After Europe, spending 3.5 months, then I went to college for 3.5 years at Cal State Northridge. And I came back in 1985 and I got married. I had a baby in 1986. And in 1985, I left college because I developed a cocaine habit in college. And that lasted until 1989. 1989 is when my life really went on a spiral, because I didn't understand why I had this cocaine habit. I was doing drugs, and I had domestic violence in my home, and I called the police, and they took my daughter away, custody of my daughter. And I could hear my mom and my sister, after they took custody, I threw my husband out, my first husband, and I went to a 7-day fast. And I could hear my mom and my sister across the hallway. And on the 7th day, my mother came and she said, "Your grandmother passed away." And she came and she took me and she said, we're gonna go on a little ride. So she put me in a VA hospital. She said, I want you to stay here for a little while. You're acting too much like your father. I said, well, what does he act like? You know, she said, your father was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so I went to the hospital, and they diagnosed me with schizophrenia. For 2 weeks, I stayed in the hospital. From there, it was in and out of hospitals, in and out of 1989. After I came out the hospital, I was diagnosed. I didn't know what schizophrenia meant. I know nothing about my father, because my father and my mother separated when he came back from the war. And so I didn't know too much about the mental illness at all. All I knew is that I needed drugs because I had a chemical imbalance going on in my brain, and I needed some drugs to make me feel good, make me feel well. So in 1989, I got busted for possession of cocaine, and I went to prison for 2 years. Mind you, I was in and out of the system of going to jail mainly because my sister happened to be a narcotics police officer. So every time I would do something, she would call on me or she'll put me in jail. I always went to jail. I mean, I don't care where I came out of, I was going to jail. So when I went to prison for 2 years and I came out, and in 1992, my mother passed away. And my sister said that I was speaking to the devil and some other things, and they put me on a 72-hour hold, which lasts to a 2-week hold, to a 3-month hold, to a 6-month hold, to a 1-year hold. So these holds lasted for a whole year, and then they diagnosed me with schizophrenia. So I came out of, and that was from 1992 to 1995, and 95, 96, I was in Palmdale. I get a knock on the door from police officer, are you eating? Are you taking your medication? And of course I'm saying no, you know, I'm a grown woman, you know, I'm taking care of myself. You go into the hospital. So I go into the hospital and I'm conserved. My sister had conservatorship over me, and she put me in a boarding care home. Mind you, I never knew what a boarding care home was. I never knew where East LA was. I did not know, and so I was conserved in a boarding care home. It was very strict, and in the year 2000, my sister passed away, and I got conservatorship taken off of me. Now, at this time, in the year 2000, I had started going to USC Hospital. So I started taking my medication in the year 2000. I no longer had a cocaine habit. I was taking my medication. I was introduced to NAMI in 2003. I tell you, in 2002, when I went back to Palmdale, I was diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia because my other grandmother had passed away. And after I came back and they was going to put me in a nursing home, I said, take me back to the boarding care home in East LA. So in 2002, 2003, I went to the boarding care home, and I was conserved by the state. The state conserved me, and I was had an incident in the boarding care home where it was it was just a confrontation. So I called the police myself, and the police came, and they put me back in the hospital, and I was discharged to the streets because the boarding care wouldn't take me back. So I was homeless in 2003. But in 2003, they told me, this is it. If you are hospitalized one more time, we're going to send you to Metropolitan State Hospital, and you're going to stay there for the rest of your life. You're going to be, that's it. So I believed them, and I was willing to do whatever it took to stay out the hospital. Now, by this time, everyone in my family is deceased. Basically, I have one aunt, but everyone is just about deceased. So in 2003, I was homeless. I was living in a motel, and I was under the doctor at USC when I was introduced to NAMI. NAMI educated me, a little lady named Stella Marsh. She's still 99 years old. she took me under her wings, and she taught me everything when it came to educating me. She'll take me everywhere. Places with NAMI, she'll take me. And she helped me. She helped educated me. The things about the prison, from 2003 until this day, I have been out of drugs. I have been working for 8 years. I went back to school, got my certification as an alcohol and drug counselor, been working as a peer advocate 8 years, and just volunteering with the Protestant Chaplain Services. I have been working at the Metropolitan State Hospital, volunteering, and it's not easy, but it's very rewarding. The jails did not help me. Being locked up in jail was horrible, especially in prison, because I was put in a hole. I was put in a hole because I had a confrontation. A girl wanted to, fight with me or something, and I didn't know anybody there. I was in prison, and so they put me in a hole. I stayed in the hole for a month. After I stayed in the hole, then they put me in the mental ward. I was at CIW, and there's for AIDS, there's a dorm for the AIDS, and there's a dorm for the mental. So they have me locked down in the mental, and it's really bad. It's already a bad place for the jails, but for the mental part in the prison is worse, because you have chains, you have doors, you can't go out certain times, and you can't be with a certain population. At first, I was with the population, but since I was mental, then I wasn't with the general population. Only you go out to get your yard to go get your meal, and then you come back. Or sometimes they send you meals in jail. They just give it to you in your cell, and you're not allowed to get out. And when I was incarcerated, a lot of times from the drug addiction, I had a drug addiction problem. Me personally, I felt that I should have been treated for my drug addiction, not so much thrown in drug because of my mental illness and my drug addiction, a co-occurring disorder. It should have been a treatment program for me to go to and address those issues. But thrown in jail, I have a sleeping disorder, so I take a lot of medication at nighttime for my anxiety, for sleeping, and for not to have the light and not to have the sleep and the noise alone. Yes, I did. And they're older drugs. The newer drugs today, before it was just Haldol and lithium and Thorazine, and you do the Thorazine shuffle, and of course you're going to look, because of the side effects of the medication, you're going to look differently. You're going to act differently. You have a lot of side effects going on with the medications that are affecting your brain, and with the stigma of having a mental illness and taking these medications with side effects, you're acting strange in jail. So you get picked on a lot. You not only get picked on a lot, but you just go through it's just a horrible experience. It's a horrible experience to be locked up in jail. I wanted to touch on that. So the sleep was bad. In 2014, today, I went to my doctor to get a letter and this is interesting, because I wanted to get a letter from my doctor saying that I was disabled and that to lower my water bill. And my doctor said, "You are not disabled," because I work. I said, "Okay, well, I'm seeing you. I'm taking a lot of medication. Why can I not have a letter saying that I'm disabled? This guy's, you're disabled. You can work." He said, "You're not disabled," and I put in writing. So I'll just read a little bit what he says in this letter. He says that historically that the patient was diagnosed delusional disorder, But most recently I did have an episode at work where the therapist had called the doctor. I had not gotten to sleep the night before, so I was tired. And the therapist called because there's a stigma. Once you've been locked up and you're considered a 5150, if someone was to call on you and say that you was acting behaviorally, they would take you to jail or take you in a hospital without even thinking. They'll just call your doctor or call, and it's on your record that you're 5150, and they just take you to jail or take you to the hospital. And I thought that was over with in my life. I've been stable since the year 2000 year 2002 from going into the hospital. That's been 12 years. So I'm thinking that that's off my record, that I'm considered okay. But I went to the hospital just 2 months ago, and I was released from the hospital, and they said I was delusional. But today I am stable, and I'm no longer considered schizophrenic, but bipolar. So now I am not delusional, but I am diagnosed with bipolar 1. So that's my diagnosis today, is bipolar 1, which I think is interesting because your diagnosis can change with your therapist that you have. Each therapist can, that is true. The therapist can change your diagnosis attending to what he feels you feel like that day. And therefore, they change your medications. And then your medication is changing, a whole set of issues come up. With this new medication, I don't know the side effects that I'm going to have down the road on this medication and how it affects me. And then if someone else were to say, okay, this person is acting strangely, I'm going to call the police. What's going to happen? After I worked so hard to get where I'm at, to go back to jail or go back to the hospital. That's the reality that I live with today. So jails did not do me justice. I think that with the jail system, there needs to be a lot of improvement, not just incarcerating, but more education. And that's what I love about NAMI, because NAMI educates people. It helps people. Not only do I do In Your Own Voice, I've been doing In Your Own Voice since 2007, but I've also do peer-to-peer. I'm teaching a class right now on peer-to-peer, educating others on mental illness and educating. And advocacy is a very much plus that NAMI do. And without NAMI, I don't know where I would be today. And I thank you.
Thank you very much for very informative. Now we want to open it up to questions. And I think what we're going to do is have you go ahead and give us your questions or ask them out loud, and then we'll repeat them so that it can be recorded. Yeah, there are some cards if you want to write them down, or you can just ask them out loud. And I'm going to have you read this because I can't.
Please address the issue of those not diagnosed with mental illness, but incarceration, losing their children, has for many created mental illness, but who addresses this silent crisis? Well, I think Christine might be best able to address that, since she had her children removed from her when she was going through that situation. Christine, do you want to speak about that?
I lost custody of my child for domestic violence in the home, but when I lost custody, it went to my sister at first, and then I went and I said, no, I wanted to go to a foster home, because my sister, I knew I'd never get it back. And I felt that going into a foster home, I would have more chances of getting my daughter back. Well, I fought the system. I did the parenting. I did everything that possibly could do to get my daughter back, and they still would never give me back my child. When she reached 18, she went into an adult facility, and within 1 week, she passed away from the adult facility.
I hear that. We've been at CIW, where you were, for 5 years now. And what we hear from the women there, and it's really sad for me because we're there with a parenting class, right? And they are told they need to take parenting so that they will have a certificate so that they can get their children back. The fact of the matter, and I would hope that the league would at some point take a look at the Department of Children's Services and how they really rob mothers of their children and don't provide them with a social worker, their attorneys. They have no clue as to how it is and where their children aren't going to get to come back to. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
I had a good relationship with the foster mother, and I did have, I had an attorney, and I was fighting, like the foster mother and me, I would go every week to see my daughter, so I had that opportunity. Plus, my mother would pick my daughter up from the foster home and take her on every other weekend, and I'd spend time with her. However, I did everything possible to get my daughter back. I did every class, everything, and they still did not give me my daughter back.
The question is, what is the status of the juvenile justice system in LA County? I'm going to presume, based on what the subject matter of this panel is, that this is specifically directed towards treatment of people, juveniles with mental illness, although I could go for hours about the problems with the juvenile justice system on a variety of different issues that have nothing to do with that. You know, I'm embarrassed to admit that, and maybe Brittany can speak to this, I have focused, because we have been involved with the LA County jail system, I've been focused on this issue with respect to adults. But I would be surprised if it's not similarly bad in the juvenile system, because if you don't have either a mentality of trying to ensure that people who become justice involved, who have mental illness, are identified and pushed towards treatment as opposed to incarceration, you're going to have the same problems in the juvenile justice system that you do in the adult system. So I'd be, and also there simply has been a starving of the resources by the Board of Supervisors who has to provide them for the community mental health system, so that it would surprise me if those resources exist that would be necessary for a really proper diversion program exist for juveniles any more than they do for adults.
I know that there is a juvenile mental health court, and according to their website, they have diverted 560 juveniles out of the system into treatment over the last 5 years.
Okay, we have another question. Please address assisted outpatient treatment and choice of jail or drug treatment. How many programs hospitals would be required to, I can't read the rest of it, but it's essentially about assisted outpatient treatment. And here in LA County, we have adopted and we're going to implement a program called Laura's Law, which is assisted outpatient treatment. Peter and I have slightly different views on this, but NAMI supports the advent of Laura's Law, which was actually passed in 2002, but is now being implemented on a broader scale. And the Department of Mental Health is going to have about 300 placements. They'll do 500 evaluations every year, but 300 placements for assisted outpatient treatment. And that's basically court-ordered treatment. So you have to comply, and in the case that you don't comply with the treatment plan, they can hospitalize you, and that would be called a 5150. And there's another question here about a 5150. Is it a crime? And a 5150 is not a crime. It's just a distinction. It's a label that they use to identify the kind of hold you're being placed on. A 5150 can turn into a 5250. 5250 can turn into a 5350. It goes on, and so these holds are being placed on you for, that's involuntary treatment, which is different than assisted outpatient treatment. I hope that's clear. But Peter, do you want to speak on that at all?
You know, this is, although as I said, we have very many areas of common ground with NAMI, I think there is a slight disagreement on this issue. But I think in large part, it's obviously really difficult, and so I have respectful disagreements on this one. The issue of people who don't necessarily have the resources to recognize that they may need treatment or benefit from treatment. I think the county, you sort of don't go to Laura's Law until you do more to really foster very aggressive outreach. And the reason I think I disagree is just because having talked with somebody who I've at Mental Health America Los Angeles, which is one of the best full service providers in the county, although their main facility is down in Long Beach, he says we really haven't done and funded and provided for aggressive outreach, and that you, in most cases, if you really do it well, but you have to work at it, you can get the same results without any coercive effect. But you know, that I think that's a respectful disagreement. It's not. I think we all agree that Brittany and I agree that we need a more robust community mental health service, and that's really, I think, a disagreement somewhat at the margins of what needs to be done. Not a reason that I would say NAMI and the ACLU are loggerheads. I think it's one area where we have a small disagreement. One of the questions here is just simply, is our report online? And the answer is yes. Here's how you would go to it. The homepage is just ACLU SoCal, SOCAL.org, but I'm never sure, kind of what shows up on the landing page. So if you want specifically to get to the page around the report, which not only has the report, but also a couple of videos, one from a man who can speak about, as Christine did, can speak about the experience of community treatment versus jail and prison, and also the woman. I described the story of a young man who committed suicide in the jail. His mother did a video talking about that experience and how it happened. So the page that is all about this report and supporting materials is ACLU SoCal /A Way Forward, without any spaces in it. It's just the title of the report, but with no spaces in it.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions about, well, we're going to divert people. Maybe there's some consensus about that, but where would we divert them to? What kinds of services are available in the community? And we can say easily that there are not enough. There's not enough beds. I told you in California there are 25 counties without any inpatient beds, but we need to work on that. That's something that the Jackie Lacey Task Force has identified as a problem to work through. That we are gaining consensus and political will around diversion, but the Board of Supervisors has to allocate enough funding to create that robust community mental health treatment plan and services. So it's something that NAMI and the ACLU will stay really tight on the Board of Supervisors about. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. It's, and there are, except to say there are different pots of fund. For example, many of you know about realignment. Realignment provided it moved responsibility for a lot of people who get involved in the criminal justice system to the county from the state system. Well, LA has chosen more than almost any other county in the state to do the vast share of its realignment money to custody, to incarcerating people. Many other counties, Contra Costa County is a classic example, a big urban county, sort of the Oakland and not Oakland, I'm sorry, but some of the west across the bay from San Francisco, the cities there, Richmond and so on. They do much more money to rehabilitation services, probation, and so on. So, and there are other sources of money too. It's just a question of the board having the will and feeling the pressure to make the choices about how they allocate the resources to treatment rather than incarceration.
Okay. Does someone here know if Pasadena's Chief Sanchez advocates with Supervisor Antonovich for alternatives to jail? How can citizens advocate for alternatives with judges and prosecutors? So that's a good question. Peter talked a lot about political organizing and advocacy, and one thing that the League of Women Voters can do is submit a letter of support for the diversion program that is currently under debate. And we'd be happy to share a couple of letters that other organizations have already drafted. NAMI's perspective is that it's great. We should be moving forward with that. There's a motion to divert $20 million to diversion programs, and NAMI says that's great, that sounds good, but that's just a down payment. We need to do a lot more. We're talking about $2 billion on a jail versus $20 million on diversion. We need to square things up a little better there.
And just add, I reached out to former Chief Malikian, and he did write a letter to the Board of Supervisors. But another way you can be an advocate is not only directly with the board, but going to your own elected officials and saying, Long Beach, the city of Long Beach passed a resolution that they're transmitting to the board in favor of diversion and so on. You can go to your own. I've tried to do it with Pasadena City Council, but we haven't gotten there yet. You can go to your own police chief and your own city council and say, this is where we are. We want you to contact the board and express your support for this. This is the way Pasadena wants the criminal justice system to evolve.
I know that Chief Sanchez has spoken at least twice at different NAMI-sponsored events, and he seems to be very sympathetic to the cause. So.
I'd be thrilled if someone. I will provide anyone who wants to reach out to the chief. I'm not saying he's opposed. He may not have thought about doing this, but I'll provide former Chief Malikian's letter, and maybe someone can go to Chief Sanchez and say you should do the same.
Yeah, that would be great. Actually, the president of NAMI San Gabriel Valley is a member of the police force for Pasadena. Okay. If people with mental illness had a decent apartment within a building complex that supports all renters, a kind of new institution, not a hospital, not a jail, do you think that would serve well, or would it turn into an abusive place? Christine, do you think you can talk about that a little bit?
I think that that could turn into an abusive place. I think people need to have their own space and be treated without the stigma of this is a place for mentally ill people to stay. As for myself, I was fortunate. My doctors, when I was homeless, helped me get Section 8 when you said you couldn't get Section 8. Section 8 was open, and I got Section 8 voucher. I had an apartment on my own for 5 years, and then I got married, my second marriage, and now we have 2 houses. So, you know, I think going step by step gradually, where a complex would just be like another prison, another jail, or another institution for people to be housed, and just another place. And people get institutionalized, where there's so much into just being in one setting, people telling you what to do, what to say, when to eat, when to take a shower, when to do this, that they don't have the freedom. I mean, I was in that state of mind. I've been to the boarding cares. I've been to the jails. I've been to the, every housing you can put to a mental person in. But I had my independence. And then when I got my independence, I was able to go forward and do more things. And with just the knowledge of NAMI and education. And I think everyone should deserve the same chance.
You may have something, Brittany, but I would just say quickly, I think one way to look at that question is that we have to remember that like many illnesses, there are different manifestations and different severities and so on, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There are people, nobody gets well on the street, so housing is an essential component of recovery, but some people do just fine linked to some services and having a roof over their head with Section 8 or whatever it is. There are, I think, some people who may need, at least at certain stages, to be in permanent supportive housing, which, if done well, doesn't have to become a horrible, abusive place, but there's services on site and may be necessary for some people. So I think there's a wide range of what works, and that's what I learned from Dave Pillen at Mental Health America Los Angeles. Some of their clients, they work to get them Section 8 housing. They make sure that they're linked up with a social worker to make sure they're getting to whatever services they may need, but they're living on their own. Others are in board and care. Some of them are in more kind of congregative housing, and you need a range of options for different life situations, different mental illnesses, and different severity of those.
Okay. Is there any procedure for eliminating the record of a mental health hold? And does it mean that whenever you are stopped by the police for anything, i.e. a traffic stop, it shows? So there should be a little bit of a sigh of relief. Right now, it's so disorganized that a police officer has no idea if you've been detained or held for a 5150. There's no communication really between law enforcement and Department of Mental Health. There is some, but it's not to the extent where they're talking about the same person for the same infraction with the same history. So there's that. There's no way of taking off a 5150 from your health record. It's part of insurance or Medicaid or Medi-Cal would know, and so there's no way to revoke that. But just on this other question, does it show up? Not necessarily. If you are somebody who has had many run-ins with law enforcement or has been in the hospital in and out several times, where you're a candidate for something like Laura's Law, then most likely you're a known factor, and maybe that would play a role. But somebody who's a regular Joe driving down the street who's had a 5150, an officer or law enforcement agent would have no clue that that's part of your history. There are certain rules called HIPAA that prevent law enforcement from gaining access to your records, and that's part of what's at play here. Do you want to speak on that?
No.
Okay. My son is currently incarcerated at Twin Towers for assault on a peace officer. He kicked a deputy in the head who was trying to restrain him to take him to the hospital. He was taken to the hospital. However, 2 weeks later, after being stabilized in the hospital, he was taken into custody and taken to jail. There's no question, but perhaps this person would like a comment on that.
Yeah, he had regressed. He was at a board and care, and they called the paramedics, and he's diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic, extremely paranoid. So when he wouldn't go with the paramedics, they called the sheriff department, and I wasn't there, so I don't know what happened, but I was just told that they were trying to restrain him to get him into the gurney, and somehow he kicked the deputy. Well, he was in pretty bad shape, so they took him to the hospital. He was stabilized, and I guess looking forward to going back to the board and care, but at that time, the deputies came, took him into custody, and yesterday I was in court, and they're charging him with assault on a peace officer and resisting arrest, but he wasn't under arrest, so I don't know where that came from. But he was so disoriented at the court hearing that the judge has now referred him to Department 95. What's going to happen then, I don't know, but he has been in close to 20 hospitals since the age of 19. He's 36. So he's severely mentally ill. So I'm just very concerned about, he hasn't had any medication since he's been in the county jail. He's regressed since then. And I'm just very concerned, especially hearing on how they treat them. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Sandra. I hope things will improve.
I mean, obviously, my heart goes out to you, and that's a horrible situation, and I'm sorry. One of the goals of a good diversion program is to train law enforcement in ways of interacting with people with mental illness that dramatically reduce the chances that you have that kind of interaction. And there's some really wonderful material that I've seen about the law enforcement officers in San Antonio talking about how they have these skills and ability to de-escalate situations instead of them escalating. Because the typical sort of law enforcement response of show force, pull out the cuffs, be tough to try to intimidate somebody into behaving, it's exactly the wrong way to respond to a situation like that with somebody who's schizophrenic or paranoid schizophrenic. And so, I wish there was some way to change the encounter that just happened for your son, but ideally you get to a place where they happen much less frequently because the law enforcement officers know how to avoid that situation and how to handle the situation in a way that recognizes it's a mental illness issue. It's not a criminal justice issue.
And I would just add that NAMI is part of the training for custody officers and for LAPD so that people on the street know how to respond to people with mental illness instead of judging them like Peter said. And I'm sorry as well. Okay.
Is there one agency that you have in mind to put together this diversion project that you're proposing? Because I think, if I ask people, should mentally ill go to prison? Everybody says no. But the question is, where? And that's what you hear here. But right now it is piecemeal, and I've been in the system for a long time. I worked at Lanterman. I worked there when they released everybody. And I was on the education side of things, but I also worked in LA where we dealt with all the psych hospitals up and down LA from Northridge to San Pedro. And whereas we could force treatment, we could force them into, doing the medication and things like that, The moment they became adults, it was out. So you've got to have, like you said, the aggressive. Does that aggressive mental health mean that you can push people to medication? I don't know, and everybody's so individualized. So that's what I'm saying. If it's a concerted effort, the public will no doubt go for it. But if it's piecemeal, it may not work.
Agreed, and the effort being led by the DA, Jackie Lacey, is a multi-agency interdisciplinary one. So we do have sheriffs and fire and police from Long Beach and Pasadena and the city of LA, the county of LA. It's supposed to be a it's the county-wide effort to address this problem. It's not one agency or one sector of the county, it's the entire county. So we have hope for that, but that remains to be seen.
I'm curious if the Department of Mental Health is looking into setting up these community treatment centers.
The Department of Mental Health is an active participant in the task force, so they've been providing updates and reports to us on a regular basis for the past year or so, and they are looking into things like alternatives to custody, like for instance, they're going to be developing these things called urgent care centers, where it'll be kind of like a drop-off point for a police officer to take someone with mental illness instead of taking them and booking them in jail. So those are in development. And they, of course, have their hands in lots of different programs throughout the county, as something like supportive housing, but these FSP full-service partnership slots, those are concerted round-the-clock efforts to engage people with mental illness in treatment. So there's that as well. Yeah, there's a question. But this woman has one.
Oh, sorry.
I don't think I need a mic.
Yes, you do.
Okay. My question deals with Proposition 47. The first part is, are you optimistic about the fact that some of the savings is earmarked for mental health? And also, does ACLU and NAMI intend to go after those funds to say they could be used for diversion services?
I'm very happy that Prop 47 passed. One of its weaknesses is there's not a lot of detail about how the savings are to be, how the funds are to be set aside, what's the process for allocating them. My understanding is that there's discussion about, well, the Board of State and Community Corrections is going to be the place that does the allocation. We recognize, we at the ACLU, and I can't speak for NAMI, but I think they probably are in the same position, that a lot of the battle on this is going to be, it's good that we're going to make the choice to do things that will reduce the prison and jail population, but then the other part of the very important part of the proposition is making sure that those funds are properly used. Well, we've had some really unfortunate experience with at least how some counties, including Los Angeles, have used their realignment funds. Give them to the sheriff's department, and give paltry little amounts to public health, which does drug treatment and and so on, and mental health. So, and even mental health, a lot of that money is probably going to mental health in the jails, not mental health outside in the streets. But I think that's just another, I'm going to sound like I'm just beating the same drum. It's about political advocacy. It's about letting the Board of Supervisors know. It's about letting state legislatures know. You want to make sure that that money is going. You voted for this, and you want to make sure that that money goes where it's supposed to go, and make clear that the voters want this money to go to those services, not to be sort of piecemealed out to counties who can then decide, well, I'm really going to try to figure out a backdoor way to get it into the jail system again.
Thanks. Corporations running prisons, pros and cons. Well, for me, prison and jail isn't a for-profit business. It doesn't lend itself to a for-profit business model. There's no bottom line there that I would think that any corporation would be respectful of. I think that it's the wrong direction.
Yeah, how do corporations make money? Cut costs. So, but there are certain baselines about how you provide security, how you treat people humanely, how you provide medical and mental health care, that the goal isn't to cut the costs, it's to do it right. And at the ACLU, which has a national prison project, which brings lawsuits about inhumane conditions in jails and prisons around the country, some of the worst offenders are the private prisons. That doesn't mean there aren't bad state-run systems, but some of the worst offenders of the private prisons. Mississippi right now, there are a couple down there that are just shock to conscience.
Okay, this looks like the last question. How does a school district, how does a school direct children who exhibit mental illness early on, specifically what programs are available in a local community? So that depends on what the symptoms and signs are. NAMI has a program called Parents and Teachers as Allies, where we train school staff and teachers on the signs and symptoms and what acting out looks like versus what mental illness looks like. And so those programs direct people into community centers like regional development centers or a local NAMI or private therapy. But there are no that I know of, but probably this room would be able to develop some alternatives to local community resources in Pasadena. I'm not sure of them.
I've been involved with the NAMI program called Basics, which is teaching parents of school-age children who exhibit symptoms of mental illness. And from what I've observed, it varies from school district to school district. Recently, just yesterday, I finished a class out in Hacienda Heights, and I was so impressed by the services that they give kids. They have excellent psychologists and psychiatrists. They have a placement, a special school for kids who cannot go to a regular school. They have a special school with very small classes with the services of the psychologists. But a lot of schools really resist labeling kids that young. And it's really a hard decision to make, because we know that many children really are depressed, bipolar, and schizophrenic by the age of 6 or 7. And it may be it had started at birth. And so they need, people recognize that early intervention now can prevent children from developing the full-blown illness as they get older. And I think that has to be a push, is teaching teachers and parents to recognize the symptoms so they can get their kids into treatment very young, because it can save lives. I mean, 1 out of every 100 kids is going to get schizophrenia. 1 out of every 100 kids will develop schizophrenia. That's the statistics. 1 out of every kid will develop bipolar disorder. Probably 5 to 7 out of every children will suffer depression sometime in their lifetime. So it's important to get treatment.
There's one question.
Can I just add one thing to what?
Repeat the name of the organization again.
NAMI?
No, the one you just spoke to where you said you were working with someone.
I was in the Hacienda Heights School District, and I teach a NAMI class called Basics, which is for the parents of children with diagnoses.
I just want to add one tiny thing about which, and Brittany may be able to speak more to this, but one of the things that Dr. Coopers, who I mentioned at the beginning, has told me is that the treatment, and it's not just medication, but treatment for some of the mental illnesses that we used to think basically, were impossible to deal with in terms of people couldn't lead productive lives, couldn't be integrated with families and communities, has really increased dramatically in the last 20 years. And that patients that he sees who probably 20 years ago you would have thought this is, just trying to cobble together any life is going to be very, very difficult, made enormous strides. And a lot of it it really isn't just medication. It is a lot of other things that go into a full-blown recovery. And so, it's just, as hard as it may be, and my grandmother had quite serious bipolar, as hard as that is, and for family members to deal with, I think we really are moving in a very positive direction in a way that diseases or mental illnesses that we used to think are kind of untreatable, as it were, really are not.
I would agree, just a caveat that that's for probably the people in the choir. I think that there's a lot of stigma out there still that we need to combat on a regular basis, which is part of NAMI's mission.
Okay, one more question over there.
Does California have any private business
The question is, does California have any privately run prisons?
No, it's interesting that the Prisons Guard Union did not get involved in Prop 47, but when you ask most political insiders in Sacramento, what are the 2 or 3 most powerful political forces in the legislature? The Prison Guards Union is one, and I think that's, as much as I'm not a fan of that, that's one good thing they've done. They've kept private prisons out of California.
Yes, one more question and then we need to stop. Yes. Marcia.
Okay, my question is, has the county league studied this? Can we take a position on what the county is doing without the county league saying that we have studied this and this is the position we want?
You know, I'm not sure on that. Sandra, Robbie, can you address that?
I think that the state league actually has, there's a mental health position at the state level, so we could look at that and see if it was applicable.
Because this is, action has to be taken and we as a league can only do what we have a mission to do.
We do have a position on mental health, so I mean, as far as writing to the.
We have to direct it towards the whole county.
Well, I'm not sure on that. Robbie?
If we're addressing a problem with the county system overall, I think it would be the county league. You don't have to write as a league, but all of individuals here, anybody is an individual. You don't have to say I'm a member of the league. You just say, you know, here's the deal and this is my personal input. But if we want to write a letter as the league, I think it would be the county league that would have to write it.
Marty said she will put advocacy contacts where you can write in the next voter with the write-up of this program. So we will know where you can address your concerns. Yes.
Yeah, I can also, I'm happy to give, I mean, we've had voices from a wide variety of, you know, law enforcement, mental health groups, forensic psychiatrists, religious groups, and others. I'm happy to give a sample of some letters but if I have one place, I'm not going to be able to send it to 20.
You could contact, yes.
4 or 5, so people can see what others have said, and you can then speak from your own heart.
And we often have at meetings, our advocacy director isn't here today. He brings sample letters, and we can also email sample letters that people can use. We can put it in our voter. And so when we do that, we like them written as individuals. When you write, take a sample letter and tweak it so it sounds, those are the most effective letters to legislators, are always something personal. You can get your facts, tweak it, but put in something, your own story or something, as an individual. So we can certainly provide you with that information. Thank you very much. Thank you. This was fabulous. You all were wonderful. And the time and the patience that